You think you know betrayal. No, no. Let me rephrase that. You think you've seen betrayal, until you've stood in your own kitchen, the one you scrubbed and wept in for 40 years, and had your own flesh and blood shout at you like you were a stray dog they found curled up in the pantry. You can't live here anymore, Ma. It's time. That's what she said. Not whispered. Not pleaded. Said it. Like she was asking me to pass the salt. And I swear, I felt my legs buckle. You're not serious. I looked around for backup, my son, my grandson, someone. Anyone. But no one met my eye. Not even little Tommy. My sweet, dimple-cheeked Tommy. He was always the soft one. But that night? He stared at his phone. After everything I did for you? I barked. My voice cracked. God, I hadn't raised it like that in years. Decades maybe. And it felt foreign. Like spitting hot iron. They flinched. As if my anger was more offensive than their betrayal. She said I'd be better off somewhere quiet. That I needed care, like I was a lawn that needed mowing, or a dog with arthritis. But let me tell you something. I still wake up at 5. Still do my stretches. I still remember every birthday, every favorite color, every allergy in this family. And yet, I was in the way. It wasn't always like this. There was a time, God, it wasn't that long ago, I was the heartbeat of this house. I ran it like a captain runs her ship. I knew every creak in the floorboards, every cupboard's echo, every spoon's proper place. And now I'm told, you need to pack up your things. Like I was an old coat no one wears anymore. You know what I said? I said, no. You need to sit down and explain to me how you can look your mother in the eye and say this out loud. Oh, that rattled them. The room got so quiet you could hear the goddamn ice melting in my glass of water. But silence can be cruel. Because they didn't explain. They wouldn't explain. They'd already made up their minds. My name was already scratched off the mailbox in their hearts. I didn't cry. I wanted to. God help me, I wanted to wail like I did when my Frank died in that hospital bed, holding my hand and telling me, don't let them forget who you are. But I didn't. I clenched my fists and stood straight. As straight as this old spine would allow. And I said, fine. You want me gone? Watch me go. Now let me tell you something about kitchens. They remember. They hold ghosts. Every tile I walked on that night still echoes my footsteps, the same ones I used to dance on with barefoot children in my arms. I passed the oven where I baked birthday cakes with dinosaur sprinkles. I passed the fridge that held their report cards, their scribbled crayon drawings, the thank you notes from kindergarten. And still, they let me walk out. I stepped out into the night with a single suitcase. My slippers were wet with dew. It was colder than I expected. Not the weather. Something colder than that. A kind of emptiness that hugged your bones from the inside. The porch light flicked off behind me. They turned it off. They turned it off before I even reached the sidewalk. You ever feel like you've been erased in real time? Like you're watching your own life delete itself? Yeah, that's what that felt like. Funny thing is, looking back, I should have seen it coming. There were signs. The way they stopped asking for my recipes. The way my birthday cards got signed, love, all of us, instead of their names. The way the chairs around the table filled with noise that no longer needed me in it. I ignored it. Because I wanted to believe that love was enough. That giving was enough. Turns out, sometimes, love is a currency that runs out when you stop being useful. And that's what broke me. Not the shouting. Not the suitcase. Not even the goddamn porch light. It was the realization that I had given them everything, my youth, my sleep, my sanity, my hands, my hips, my dreams. And the minute I stopped bending to their needs, they snapped me like a dry twig. But here's the thing. Twigs burn. And I may be old, but I'm not done burning. You hear me? That night, that beautiful, terrible night, I became someone new. Not someone's mother. Not someone's wife. Not the sweet grandma who knits little hats and shuts her mouth. No. I became a woman on fire. And the spark was betrayal. That night, everything changed. And thank God it did. Because this story, it doesn't end on that porch. It begins there. You want to know who I was before that night? Let me take you back. Let me tell you what I gave up. Let me tell you about the life I lived in silence. My life of giving. Before I became the woman who walked away with nothing but a suitcase and a spine made of embers, I was someone else entirely. I was the giver. The one who filled every crack in this family's life like cement. Meals. Money. Middle of the night car rides to pick them up from parties they never should have gone to. I was the human version of, don't worry about it, the one who fixed things before they broke, who remembered every appointment, every sore throat, every bad dream. Let me tell you about the choices I made. No one asked me to make them, mind you. But that's the thing about women like me, we do it because it feels like breathing. I didn't sit down one day and decide, you know what sounds fun? Erasing myself. It happened slowly. Like dripping water on stone. You don't notice until one day you wake up and the woman you used to be is just gone. My relationship with my daughter, Susan, God love her, began like any mother-daughter bond. She came into this world wrinkled and wailing and beautiful. I remember holding her for the first time, thinking, this is it. This is my life's meaning. I devoted everything to her. When she was sick, I stayed up for nights with a cold cloth on her forehead. When she was heartbroken, I made chocolate pudding and watched the same awful movie with her on repeat until she could laugh again. I gave her pieces of me she never even realized were pieces. I didn't count. I didn't keep score. But I remember the first time something felt off. It was subtle. She was 16. I had just surprised her with a birthday cake shaped like a piano. She'd wanted to learn piano once, and I remembered. She looked at it, forced a smile, and said, cool, thanks. That was it. No hug. No moment. I stood there holding the knife, waiting for the gratitude to pour in. It didn't. I told myself, teenagers. That's all. But it chipped something. And it didn't stop there. Over the years, the warmth in her voice dimmed. Our phone calls became shorter. My advice started feeling like a burden to her, not a gift. But I still gave. When she had Tommy, I moved into the guest room for a year to help. I cooked, cleaned, changed diapers, held her while she cried from exhaustion. She'd thank me occasionally, but it always sounded like a receipt being handed back, not like something from the heart. I told myself it didn't matter. Because that's what we do, right? We mothers. We tell ourselves love is supposed to hurt a little. That thanklessness is part of the job. We believe that the good we give will come back someday. That it has to. Before I became everyone's caretaker, I used to be someone. Not in the grand, headline-worthy way. I didn't want the world. I just wanted to write. Did you know that? I had stories in me, whole notebooks full. I used to sit on the porch when Frank worked late and scribble poems about the way the wind touched the laundry on the line. I dreamed of submitting them to magazines. I even mailed one once. Got a rejection letter. Cried. But it wasn't the rejection that stopped me, it was motherhood. It was bills and bruised knees and math homework and casserole dishes. So I told myself, later. And later never came. It's strange, the moments that come back to you when you feel discarded. One Tuesday afternoon, probably 15 years ago, I was sitting in the car while Susan ran into the pharmacy. Tommy was maybe 4, in the back seat. He reached forward, touched my shoulder, and said, "Grandma, when I grow up, I want to be like you. You always look happy." That moment kept me going for years. That tiny, innocent praise. Like he saw me, really saw me, for a second. But even that faded. As he grew, I became background noise. I was the one who drove him places, paid for snacks, folded his laundry. But I wasn't the one he texted with news. I wasn't the one he confided in. He had his parents, his friends, his world. And I was a shadow in the hallway, making sure the lights stayed on and the fridge stayed full. The warning signs of what happened that night, when they told me I had to leave, they were everywhere. I just didn't want to read them. Like the Christmas I offered to host and Susan said, maybe it's time we start new traditions. Or the way they started calling less, asking less. Or how they began to refer to the house as theirs, not ours. Even the way my chair at the dinner table got moved to the corner, away from the window I loved. And still, I gave. I thought love could survive on one-way energy. I thought, eventually, they'd remember who I was. What I did. I thought if I kept giving, they'd wake up and see me. But they didn't. You want to know what the deepest cut is? It's not the yelling. It's not even the eviction masked as love. It's the way they forgot I had a self. A past. A soul. They started to treat me like a couch. Comfortable. Familiar. But only useful when needed. And I let it happen. That's the part that stings the most. I let it. I stood by, smiling, while they took. And took. And took. And I kept offering seconds. There's something brutal about that realization, that you raised your children to feel entitled to your silence. That somewhere in all your mothering, you taught them that you didn't need anything. That your presence was a given, like air. And that air doesn't get thanked. But I did need something. I just never said it out loud. I needed to be seen. To be loved not for what I could do, but for who I was when I wasn't doing anything. I needed someone to say, "You matter," not, "You're useful." And the worst part? I never even knew how to ask for that. Because by the time I realized I was missing something, I'd already packed away all the parts of me that wanted it. I used to love lilacs. Did you know that? Every spring, I'd cut a handful and put them in a chipped vase on the kitchen table. Susan once told me the smell gave her headaches, so I stopped. I haven't smelled a lilac in 10 years. I used to dance. Before my knees went bad. I'd turn up the radio and twirl around the living room while Frank clapped from the couch. Susan hated the noise. Tommy once rolled his eyes. So I danced in my bedroom with the door closed. Until one day, I just stopped altogether. I used to sing in the shower. Write poems in the margins of recipe cards. I used to wear lipstick just because I liked the color. Bit by bit, I quieted myself for their comfort. Bit by bit, I disappeared. And you know what the worst part is? They didn't even notice. That's the kind of pain that doesn't come with a scream. It comes with silence. It comes when you're sitting in a room full of people you love more than your own breath, and you feel invisible. That night they asked me to leave, it was a mercy in disguise. I didn't know it then. I was too full of shock, rage, sorrow. But now I see it. It was the first time they said out loud what they'd been saying quietly for years: "You don't belong here anymore." And maybe they were right. Maybe I didn't belong there anymore. Maybe I'd been clinging to a role I'd outgrown long ago, a giver to people who'd stopped giving back. But I'll tell you this. Leaving didn't end me. It freed me. It cracked the dam wide open. The one I'd built with casseroles and car rides and quiet nods. It made room for something else. Something unexpected. But I'm getting ahead of myself. There's something else I need to show you first. Something I found in a box buried deep in the back of a closet I hadn't opened in years. And what I found? It changed everything. The deeper cut. What really broke me wasn't that they told me to leave. It wasn't the words, or the cold precision in my daughter's voice when she said it. No, what shattered me came after, the quiet aftermath, when I was alone in that small guest room, the one I used to call my sanctuary. I sat on the edge of the bed, the same one I had rocked my grandson to sleep in years ago when he had a fever and called out, "Nana," like it was a spell. My suitcase sat on the floor, half-zipped, mocking me. And that's when I saw it, just barely poking out from beneath the bed, dusty and nearly forgotten, a battered cardboard box sealed with aging yellow tape and my own handwriting in faded ink, "Private." I almost didn't open it. I almost left it to rot there in that room like so many other forgotten pieces of me. But something told me I had to. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the need to prove, even to myself, that I existed before them. That there was something here worth saving. Inside that box were notebooks. Dozens of them. Spiral-bound, leather-bound, some barely held together with paper clips. They were filled with my handwriting, stories, poems, sketches of thoughts that once made my heart race. I held them to my chest and something in me cracked open. I could still smell the ink, the faint perfume I used to wear when I wrote late at night with a cup of tea beside me. That scent hit me like a train, dragging along the memory of a woman who once dared to dream. I didn't even realize I was crying until the pages blurred beneath my eyes. Not the kind of crying that spills out in sobs, but the slow, steady kind that carves rivers down your face without making a sound. I stayed in that room for hours, cross-legged on the floor, reading the words of a girl I hadn't spoken to in 50 years. She was witty. She was sharp. She was angry and romantic and messy and brave. And I mourned her. God, I mourned her like she had died in my arms. The pain of that discovery wasn't sharp, it was heavy, suffocating. My body felt it before my mind could catch up. My chest tightened with each sentence I read, my hands trembled as I turned the pages. I could feel something crawling up my spine, like every cell in my body had suddenly remembered it was still alive, still capable of feeling more than just responsibility and fatigue. My knees ached from sitting so long, but I couldn't move. It was as if leaving that spot meant leaving her again. And I couldn't bear to lose her twice. I kept reading until the sun rose through the thin curtains and lit up the room in that pale, judgmental way mornings sometimes do, like the world itself was asking, "What now?" Later, back in the silence of my own thoughts, I couldn't stop thinking about how different things were when Frank was alive. He saw me. Not just as the mother of his children, or the manager of his home, but as me. He'd bring me blank notebooks every birthday, say, "Fill these up with trouble." And I did. I filled them with worlds. I filled them with longings I couldn't say out loud. But when he died, something inside me closed up like a book left too long in the rain. And no one noticed. No one said, "Hey Ma, when's the last time you wrote something just for you?" They just let it fade. And I let them. The day after I found that box, I looked in the mirror and said it out loud, "They don't love you. Not really. They love the function you've served. The meals. The babysitting. The rides. The silence." I don't even know where those words came from. I said them like a confession, but they felt like an accusation. And in saying them, I knew something had to break, either me, or the mold I'd let harden around me for so many years. That was the moment. The real one. The breaking point. I remember standing in the shower, letting the hot water scald my back, hoping it would wash the feeling off me, the shame, the grief, the rage, but it didn't. It clung to me, sticky and raw. My skin tingled, my heart pounded, my mind screamed, and for the first time in my life, I screamed back. Not out loud. Not a sound. But in my mind, I roared. I yelled every single thing I'd never said. How dare you forget who I was? How dare you shrink me down to something disposable? I gave you everything. I gave until there was nothing left of me but habits and lists and casseroles. I remembered once when Susan was 13, and she got sick, really sick. Flu that turned into pneumonia. I slept in a chair beside her bed for 3 nights, changing the cool rag on her forehead every hour, counting her breaths. She doesn't remember that. Of course she doesn't. But I do. I remember the way her small hand clutched mine like an anchor. And I wonder, what moment of mine will she remember? If any? There's a kind of heartbreak that doesn't bleed. It bruises you from the inside out. That's what this was. Not just sadness. Not just betrayal. It was the violent realization that I had been living inside someone else's story for decades. And they had long since stopped writing me in. I was a background character in the lives I helped build. I was scenery. Comfort. Familiar. Forgettable. And so I decided, in that suffocating silence of realization, that I would never again let anyone write my story for me. Not my daughter. Not my grandson. Not the grief. Not even the ghosts of who I used to be. Because if I was going to live out the rest of my years in silence, it would be a silence I chose. If I was going to be invisible, it would be because I was finally watching my life unfold, not theirs. But even more than that, what if I didn't have to be invisible at all? What if, after all these years, I could bring that girl in the notebooks back? What if she'd been waiting all along? That idea, tiny, flickering, barely more than a whisper in the dark, it became my lifeline. I didn't know what came next. But I knew this, would not spend another day pretending that the slow erasure of my soul was normal. I would not apologize for missing the woman I once was. And I would not, could not, go quietly into that cage they built for me. And that, my dear, is the moment I started to crawl out of the grave I had been politely living in. Baby steps toward myself. The first time I stood up for myself was so small, you might laugh. I didn't march into anyone's office. I didn't yell or slam any doors. I didn't post some triumphant announcement online, demanding to be seen. No. I made oatmeal. That's it. I made oatmeal the way I used to like it before Susan started saying it was too thick and too much cinnamon. I stood in that borrowed kitchen at the women's shelter, tiny, sterile, full of clattering pans and whispered trauma, and I made myself a bowl of oatmeal so thick a spoon stood upright in it. I added twice the cinnamon. I didn't ask if anyone else wanted some. I didn't worry about it being too much. I sat down, and I ate it slowly. Spoon by spoon. Alone. And that bite? That bowl? It was the first time in decades I'd done something entirely for myself, without adjusting it for someone else's palate. I know it sounds ridiculous, but in that moment, it felt like taking the first breath after being underwater for too long. After that, things began to shift, not in grand, sweeping ways, but like a house settling on its foundation. I started talking to myself differently. I stopped calling myself stupid when I forgot something. I started saying, "It's okay, you're doing your best." I looked in the mirror and instead of sighing at the wrinkles, the bags under my eyes, the way gravity had softened my face, I started saying, "You've lived. You're still here." I began treating myself the way I had treated everyone else for so many years, with gentleness, with grace, with patience. It felt unnatural at first, like trying on someone else's shoes. But over time, those words began to feel like mine. The first thing I changed in my surroundings was my bed. It sounds small, I know, but when you've been the one making beds for everyone else your whole life, choosing your own becomes an act of rebellion. I stripped off the bland beige sheets they gave me and walked 2 miles to a thrift store where I found a second-hand quilt, loud, floral, and completely inappropriate. I carried it back in a plastic bag that kept tearing in the wind. I patched the holes with tissue and determination. That night, I spread it over my mattress, tucked it tight, and laid down under it like a queen. That quilt didn't match the room, but it matched me. Bold. A little chaotic. Soft in all the right places. And then there was Myra. She was the unexpected ally. One of the younger women at the shelter, mid-30s, tattoos like armor, always listening to music through one earbud. She noticed me writing in a notebook one night at the communal table and said, "What are you working on, Grandma?" And not in a condescending way. In a curious, real way. I told her, just scribbles. She asked to read some, and when I handed her a page, my hands trembled. I braced for her to laugh. But she didn't. She looked up with wide eyes and said, "Damn, this is really good." That was the first time in maybe 50 years anyone had read my words without filtering them through the lens of who I was to them, mother, wife, background character. She saw the words. She saw me. Not everyone was happy about the new me, of course. Susan called a week later, after getting my new number from someone at the shelter, I suspect, and her voice was full of the usual sweet concern laced with expectation. "Mom, we're worried." "What are you doing? Living in some group home? That's not like you." And for the first time, I didn't rush to reassure her. I didn't explain. I just said, "I'm okay. I'm writing. I'm resting. I'm finding myself again." There was a long pause. Then she said, "You sound different." I didn't tell her what I wanted to say, that I wasn't becoming different. I was just peeling back everything they'd piled on top of me for years. She didn't like it. I could tell. She asked if I wanted to move in with Aunt Margaret or maybe they could look at an assisted living place. I smiled, not the tight, please like me smile I used to wear like a mask, but the calm smile of someone who knows she won't be caged again. I said, "No, thank you." She didn't push. Not then. But I knew the discomfort was growing on her side. Because when a woman who's been silent for decades finds her voice, the people who benefited from her silence start to squirm. But I wasn't doing this to make them squirm. I was doing this because for the first time in my life, I felt like there was space inside me. Space for me. Not just the echoes of others' needs. I started going on walks every morning. I wrote until my fingers cramped. I joined a writing circle at the local library, just a few retired women and one kind-eyed man named Lou who wore the same cardigan every week and always brought extra tea bags to share. I shared one of my old poems. They clapped. Lou said, "That last line? That's a gut punch." In a good way. And I realized, I still had something to say. People still wanted to hear it. I had value beyond what I could do for someone else. That winter, I walked past a mirror in the library lobby and caught my reflection. I didn't look younger. I didn't look stronger. But I looked lighter. Like something had been unhooked from my shoulders. And I thought to myself, maybe the worst thing they ever did, telling me to leave, was also the greatest gift. Because they made it so clear I was no longer welcome in the life I'd spent decades building. They forced me out. And in doing so, they forced me to find the door I'd never dared to open. And when I found it, I didn't knock. I walked through it. The truth I couldn't ignore. It was late January when I found the truth that changed everything. Cold outside, sharp kind of cold that bites at your knuckles and makes the air taste like metal. I'd just come back from the library, arms full of secondhand books and cheap pens, and the room felt unusually still. Not quiet. Still. Like something was waiting for me. I sat on the bed, that ridiculous floral quilt wrapped around my legs, and I felt restless in a way I hadn't since the day I left my daughter's house. I needed to put something down on paper, something that had been aching under my skin for days. So I opened one of the old notebooks, the ones from the box I'd found, and tucked inside was a single yellowing envelope I hadn't noticed before. My name was written on it in Frank's handwriting. My chest thudded. That unmistakable slant to his letters, a mix of softness and urgency. It was dated 2 weeks before he died. I don't know how it ended up there. Maybe I had tucked it away in grief. Maybe I wasn't ready to read it before. But that night, I sat there for hours, just holding that letter. The paper was soft at the corners, worn by time and maybe the weight of meaning it carried. I didn't read it right away. I just held it. My fingers traced the letters of my name like they were sacred. Frank. My Frank. The only person who ever looked at me and said, "You are enough. Just as you are." I finally unfolded it, hands trembling so badly I thought I might tear it in two. It wasn't long. He never used more words than he needed. But every one of them sliced through me like light through water. He wrote that he knew he was leaving, even before the doctors had said it out loud. He wrote that he'd watched me disappear slowly for years, not in body, but in spirit, and it hurt him more than the cancer. He said he had always believed I would find my way back to myself, eventually. That I had fire in me, even if I forgot it. He wrote, "Don't let them turn you into wallpaper, love. You were born to be the whole damn wall." I broke. Not the small, neat kind of crying. The gut-pulling, breath-stealing kind. I clutched that letter to my chest and rocked like a woman who had just remembered she still had skin beneath her apron. It made me wonder who I really was, if not just a mother, not just a caretaker. I sat there asking myself that for hours, letting the truth burn slowly through the fog I'd lived in for decades. If I wasn't who they needed me to be, then who was I? I thought back to the girl who used to ride her bike with her hair flying out behind her like a ribbon of defiance. I thought about the woman who used to whisper stories into Frank's ear under the sheets, laughing at her own metaphors. I thought about the way my hands still reached for a pen when my chest felt tight. Maybe that was who I was all along. Maybe I didn't lose her. Maybe I just stopped listening. And suddenly, all those memories of the last few decades, the ones I'd brushed aside, the ones I'd accepted as just how it is, suddenly they looked different. The silence at the dinner table. The way Susan started talking over me when we had guests. The missed calls. The birthdays where I cooked my own cake. They weren't small oversights. They were bricks in a wall they built around me, slowly, without malice, but without thought either. And I'd helped. God help me, I'd handed them the mortar. I reinterpreted every moment with new eyes, and what I saw wasn't pretty, but it was honest. And that honesty felt like a rebirth. Ugly, painful, but mine. That night, I made a promise to myself. I took out a fresh page and wrote it down like a contract. No more shrinking. No more apologizing for needing space, or wanting to be heard, or dreaming at this age. No more saying yes when I meant no. I promised I would honor that girl in the notebooks. I promised to stop calling it selfish to put myself first for once. And I promised to stop waiting for someone else to give me permission to matter. I lit a candle, pressed Frank's letter between two clean pages, and placed the notebook at the foot of my bed like a holy object. Then I sat in the dark, watching the candle flicker, and whispered, "Thank you." Not just to him. To myself. For surviving long enough to finally come home. Becoming my own person. The first thing I did was change my appearance. Not dramatically, not the way the movies would show it. No wild haircut, no new wardrobe, no piercings or tattoos to scream, "I'm not who I was." No, mine was quiet, deliberate, sacred. I walked into a small beauty salon tucked between a laundromat and a pawn shop, the kind of place with faded pictures of hairstyles taped to the mirror and a little bowl of butterscotch candies no one ever touched. The woman who ran it, her name was Lydia, had hair dyed the color of cherries and hands that moved with a kind of tenderness that made me feel safe. I sat in that chair, my coat still buttoned up, and said, "I don't want to look invisible anymore." That was all I said. She didn't ask questions. She just nodded, unfastened my coat like a mother might, and got to work. As she combed through my thinning hair, her fingers gentle and rhythmic, I stared at my reflection, not to check for beauty, but to memorize the face I had hidden from for years. It was strange, this woman in the mirror. Her skin sagged in places I didn't remember, and her eyes held a tiredness that went deeper than sleep. But there was something else too. Something I hadn't seen in a long time. A flicker. A quiet defiance beneath the weariness. Lydia trimmed the ends, shaped my hair around my face, and when she turned the chair around for the final reveal, I almost didn't recognize myself. Not because I looked drastically different, but because I looked present. I looked like a woman who had decided to be seen. After that, I bought myself a coat. A red one. I'd never owned red anything before, too bold, too loud, too look at me, and I'd spent most of my life trying to take up as little space as possible. But there it was, hanging on a clearance rack at a department store that smelled like stale perfume and warm plastic. It was the kind of red that made no apologies. And I needed that. I slipped it on, fastened the buttons, and felt taller. That coat didn't change my life, but it changed how I walked into rooms. And for a woman who had spent years entering like a whisper, that mattered. I knew confronting them, Susan, Tommy, even the silence Frank left behind, would require strategy. It wasn't about vengeance. I had no desire to hurt them. What I wanted was clarity. Closure, maybe. Or perhaps just the dignity of no longer being a character in a story I didn't author. So I made a plan, not with sharp edges, but with structure. I began writing again, really writing. Not just the poems or reflections, but letters I never sent. Pages and pages addressed to Susan, trying to explain what it felt like to be discarded by the people you gave your life to. Letters to Frank, apologizing for all the times I'd buried my voice when he was alive and trusting that he would carry it for me. I wrote to myself, too. To the younger version who had once dreamed of seeing her name in print, and to the older version who had nearly forgotten she still had a name at all. The truth is, when you spend your whole life serving others, you forget how to serve yourself. You forget how to ask questions like, what do I want today? Or, what do I enjoy? The questions become foreign, awkward in your mouth. So I began with small answers. I wanted peace. I wanted to feel the sun on my face without rushing to meet someone else's schedule. I wanted to walk into a bookstore and buy a novel with a love story that had nothing to do with sacrifice or compromise. I wanted to eat soup in silence without explaining why I wasn't hungry enough for a second bowl. I wanted to be asked how I was and have time to figure out the answer. I started surrounding myself with people who actually saw me, not as someone's mother, or grandmother, or caregiver, but as me. At the shelter, I found a few other women who'd been carved into shapes they didn't ask for. Dolores, who'd spent her life as a nurse and now painted tiny landscapes on old record sleeves. Marcy, who swore like a sailor but cried at commercials. And Myra, young but wise, who had a daughter she hadn't seen in 3 years and a laugh that could crack open the darkest day. We formed something unspoken. We didn't call it friendship, it was more like refuge. A place we could each be broken without apology. I started reading my poetry aloud to them during slow evenings, our folding chairs huddled around space heaters, styrofoam cups of instant coffee warming our hands. They listened. They clapped. Sometimes they cried. And for the first time, my words felt useful, not as comfort, not as duty, but as truth. And then, one afternoon, I did something just for me. I walked into a community center that offered workshops and paid $30 from the small allowance I'd been saving to join a creative writing class. $30 might not sound like much, but to me, it was a declaration. I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. I sat in that classroom, surrounded by strangers who were younger, louder, more certain. At first, I felt like an intruder. What was I doing here? What right did I have to take up this space? But when I read my piece, an essay about losing your voice inside your own family, something shifted. The room went still. A young woman with blue hair wiped her eyes. The instructor nodded slowly. And I felt, not pride, exactly, but belonging. I belonged there. Not because I had anything to prove, but because I had something to say. I could feel the confrontation coming, like a storm building on the edge of a sky you thought was clear. It wasn't about anger anymore. I had burned through that. This was about truth. My truth. I wasn't going to knock on their door and scream. I wasn't even going to demand an apology. But I needed to speak the words I'd carried like lead in my chest for too long. Not because they deserved my story, but because I did. Because I needed to hear it in my own voice, needed to let it leave my body and enter the world where it could breathe. And still, even with all this quiet strength blooming inside me, there were moments of fear. I'd wake in the middle of the night, sweat chilling my skin, heart pounding at the thought of being alone forever. Of dying quietly in a room that wasn't mine. Of being forgotten completely. But those moments passed. And each time they did, I found myself steadier. Loneliness and freedom often walk hand in hand. I was learning not to fear their company. Sometimes, I would walk past families on the street, mothers holding toddlers, teens rolling their eyes, fathers shouting for someone to slow down, and I would feel a pang. Not jealousy. Not longing. But memory. A reminder that I had lived a whole life before this one. That I had carried babies on my hip, scraped knees, sung lullabies. That I had mattered once, in the way the world understands. And then, like a whisper beneath all that noise, I'd remember, I still matter. Not because someone calls me mom. But because I wake up every morning and decide to keep becoming. That was the difference. No one could take that from me now. Finding my voice. The room smelled like coffee gone cold and nervous sweat. It was a small community center auditorium, the kind with folding chairs that squeaked when you shifted and a stage barely elevated enough to make you feel important. But tonight, it felt monumental. The air buzzed with anticipation, not just from the crowd, but from me. My chest tightened with every breath, my hands trembling so badly I had to grip the edges of the podium to steady them. This was it. My first live reading. I hadn't planned on inviting them. Not really. A part of me wanted to keep this moment sacred, untouched by the people who had once made me feel invisible. But another part, a braver, angrier, more hopeful part, knew they needed to be here. Not because they deserved it, but because I did. So I sent the invitations. Simple cards, no frills, no apologies. You're invited to hear me read my work, it said. No pleading, no explanations. Just an invitation. And they came. All of them. Susan, Tommy, even little Claire, who used to call me Nana until she stopped calling altogether. They filed in quietly, their faces unreadable masks. I watched them from backstage, hidden behind a heavy velvet curtain, my heart pounding like a trapped bird. For a moment, I thought about running. About slipping out the back door and disappearing into the night. But then I remembered, I wasn't that woman anymore. I was someone new. Someone who didn't run. When the host introduced me, I stepped onto the stage with my head held high. I wore the red coat, of course. How could I not? It was armor now, a declaration to the world, and to myself, that I was done shrinking. As I approached the podium, I scanned the audience. There they were, sitting together in the second row, looking smaller than I remembered. Smaller and quieter. For years, they had been the ones holding all the power, the ones who decided where I belonged, what I was worth. But not tonight. Tonight, I insisted they sit among the strangers, just like everyone else. No special treatment. No backstage passes. If they wanted to see me, they would have to look up at me like the rest of the world did. The spotlight hit my face, warm and unrelenting. I took a deep breath, letting the silence stretch for a moment longer than necessary. Then I began. I loved you all so much I forgot to love myself. The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy, like a knife slicing through fog. I paused, letting them sink in. Letting them land where they needed to. Susan's jaw tightened. Tommy looked down at his shoes. Claire fidgeted with the hem of her sweater. Good. Let them squirm. Let them feel the weight of what I'd carried for decades. I didn't name names. I didn't point fingers or recount specific moments. Instead, I shared excerpts from my notebooks, the raw, unfiltered pieces of myself I had buried under layers of casseroles and car rides. I read about the mother who stayed up nights rocking sick children, only to be forgotten when they grew well. About the wife who danced alone in her bedroom because the music was too loud for anyone else. About the grandmother who sat silently at the dinner table while conversations swirled around her, unnoticed and unneeded. One passage struck harder than the others. I could hear my voice shaking as I read it, each word clawing its way out of my throat. For years, I gave everything I had to give, my time, my energy, my dreams. And when there was nothing left to give, I gave silence. Silence became my currency, my apology, my way of staying small so no one would notice how much space I actually needed. But silence is a hungry thing. It eats you alive, piece by piece, until there's nothing left but echoes of who you used to be. The room was still. So still I could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. When I glanced at the second row, I saw Susan staring at her lap, her lips pressed into a thin line. Tommy's eyes were glassy, his hands clenched into fists. And Claire? She was crying, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. Without a word, she stood up and walked out, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound that cut through the quiet like a scream. But not everyone reacted with discomfort. In the front row, Myra clapped slowly, her hands moving in deliberate, rhythmic applause. One by one, others joined in, first Dolores, then Marcy, then Lou from the writing circle. By the time I finished reading, the entire room erupted into applause. Not the polite, obligatory kind. The kind that makes your bones vibrate and your soul swell. I didn't bow or smile or thank them. I simply stood there, rooted to the spot, letting the sound wash over me like waves crashing against a shore. Afterward, people lined up to speak to me. Strangers shook my hand, told me my words resonated with them, asked if I had a book coming out. I didn't, but maybe someday. Friends from the shelter hugged me tightly, their arms wrapping around me like shields. Through it all, I searched the crowd for Susan, Tommy, Claire. But they were gone. They had slipped out during the applause, leaving empty chairs behind. At first, I felt a pang of disappointment. Maybe regret. Had I pushed too hard? Said too much? But then I realized something. It didn't matter. Their reaction, or lack thereof, didn't define me anymore. What mattered was that I had spoken. That I had taken up space. That I had finally given myself permission to matter. As I packed up my things and prepared to leave, I noticed something on the seat where Susan had been sitting. A folded piece of paper, neatly placed like a bookmark. I picked it up, unfolded it, and read the single sentence scrawled across the page. "I'm sorry we forgot how to see you." It wasn't perfect. It wasn't closure. But it was a start. That night, as I walked home under a sky full of stars, I felt lighter. Like something had shifted inside me, rearranging itself into a shape I recognized. I wasn't whole yet. Maybe I never would be. But I was becoming. Becoming my own person. Becoming someone who refused to be erased. And that, I realized, was enough. My new life. They started calling again. Not right away, of course. It took time for the shock to wear off, for them to realize I wasn't coming back with my tail tucked between my legs, ready to fold laundry and bake pies while they went about their lives as if nothing had happened. At first, it was just Susan. She called on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice tight but polite, like she was forcing herself through some invisible script. "I'm checking in," she said, as though those 4 words could erase everything that came before. I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence stretch long enough to make her uncomfortable. Finally, I said, "That's nice." She stumbled over her next sentence, something about how Tommy missed me, how Claire asked when I'd visit. I listened without responding, sipping tea from a chipped mug I'd bought at a flea market. When she paused for breath, I told her, "Tell them I'm writing a book. Maybe someday I'll dedicate it to them." Then I hung up. It wasn't cruel. Not really. Just honest. And maybe that honesty stung more than any insult could have because it forced her to see what I already knew. I wasn't theirs anymore. If they wanted me in their lives, it would be on my terms, not as the woman who cleaned up after them or cooked their meals or patched their wounds, but as someone whole and separate. Someone who mattered even when she wasn't giving anything away. Slowly, they began reaching out. Tommy sent a text once a week, short, awkward messages like, "Hey Nana, hope you're doing okay," followed by a random photo of his dog or a meme he thought was funny. Claire mailed me a card with a drawing of a flower on the front and scribbled inside, "love you." No explanation, no apology, just those 2 words. It wasn't much, but it was enough, for now. Susan kept calling, always careful, always cautious. Over time, our conversations grew less stiff. She stopped trying to convince me to move closer or apologize for leaving. Instead, she asked questions. Real ones. About my writing, about the shelter, about the people I'd met. Once, she even laughed at one of my jokes. It felt strange, hearing her laugh like that again, as if we were rediscovering each other not as mother and daughter, but as 2 women who might actually enjoy each other's company. But here's the thing, I didn't need them to fill the gaps anymore. For so many years, their presence defined me. Now, I defined myself. They could stay or go, it was their choice, but either way, I was done chasing scraps of love that left me starving. But here's the thing, I didn't need them to fill the gaps anymore. For so many years, their presence defined me. Now, I defined myself. They could stay or go, it was their choice, but either way, I was done chasing scraps of love that left me starving. Freedom feels like mornings where the only sound is the hum of the refrigerator and the scratch of my pen against paper. It feels like sitting at the tiny kitchen table in my studio apartment, sunlight streaming through the window, coffee steaming in a mug with a crack down the side. There's no rush to get anywhere, no list of chores waiting to swallow the day. Just me, the page, and the quiet. Silence used to terrify me. It felt like an accusation, a reminder of how empty I'd become. But now? Silence feels like safety. Like a room where I can breathe deeply without worrying about stepping on someone else's toes. I don't tiptoe around anymore. I don't whisper or soften my edges to fit into spaces too small for me. The world is loud enough without adding my own noise. Sometimes, silence is the loudest thing I've ever heard, and it's beautiful. There are mornings when I wake up and lie there for a moment, just listening. To nothing. To everything. To the birds outside my window, the distant rumble of traffic, the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. These are the moments I treasure most, the ones where I feel fully alive, fully present. Where I remember that I am not just a ghost haunting the halls of someone else's life. And then there's the writing. Oh, the writing. It pours out of me like water breaking through a dam. Stories about women who refuse to disappear. Poems about hands that hold power instead of surrender. Essays about the weight of being seen, or unseen. Some days, I write until my fingers ache and my eyes blur. Other days, I sit with a blank page and let the stillness speak for itself. Either way, it's mine. Every word, every line, every jagged edge. Mine. At the shelter, I found my tribe. Women who know me not as Susan's mom or Tommy's grandma, but as Grace, the writer, the storyteller, the woman in the red coat. We gather in the evenings, huddled around mismatched furniture, sharing pieces of ourselves. Dolores reads poems she wrote during chemotherapy. Marcy tells stories about her ex-husband that make us laugh until we cry. Myra sings old songs in Spanish, her voice raw and unpolished but achingly beautiful. We call each other by nicknames and inside jokes. They tease me about my floral quilt, grandma chic, they call it, and steal bites of the oatmeal cookies I bring to meetings. They cheer when I read excerpts from my work, clapping like children at a school play. For the first time in decades, I feel like part of something, not because I'm needed, but because I belong. Then there's Lou from the writing circle. He brings extra tea bags every week and quotes Hemingway like it's scripture. One day, after class, he handed me a copy of The Sun Also Rises with a note tucked inside, for Grace, who reminds me why we write. I carried that note in my pocket for weeks, pulling it out whenever I doubted myself. Because sometimes, you need someone else to remind you of your worth before you can believe it yourself. These people, they aren't replacements for my family. There's something better. Something real. They see me. Truly see me. And in return, I see them. Flaws and all. Together, we're building a kind of family that doesn't demand perfection or sacrifice. A family where everyone gets to take up space. One Saturday morning, I loaded up the car with boxes of china sets and heirlooms I'd been hoarding for years. Plates I never used, silverware I never polished, trinkets I never cared about. Things passed down from Frank's mother, from my grandmother, from women who probably didn't want them either but felt obligated to keep them anyway. I drove to the thrift store and unloaded everything onto the counter. The clerk raised an eyebrow when she saw the pile of fine porcelain and crystal vases, but she didn't ask questions. As I walked out, I felt lighter. Like I'd shed another layer of someone else's expectations. Back home, I rearranged the shelves in my apartment. Made space for things that mattered: notebooks, pens, books, photographs of Frank and me laughing on a beach somewhere. Things that reminded me of who I am, not who I was told to be. Later that night, I lit a candle and burned Frank's letter. Not because I wanted to forget it, but because I wanted to release it. To let go of the guilt and grief that had tethered me to the past. Watching the paper curl and blacken, I whispered, "Thank you." For the first time, I meant it. Looking back, moving forward. The room buzzed with laughter and clinking glasses, the kind of noise that felt alive. It wasn't a fancy venue, just the community center where I'd taken my first writing class, but it was perfect. Strings of fairy lights hung from the ceiling, casting golden glows on faces I now knew better than my own. My chosen family. Dolores had made tiny paintings as centerpieces, each one depicting a scene from my book. Marcy brought a playlist of songs she swore were inspirational, though half of them were about heartbreak. Myra stood by the door, greeting people with her signature grin, her daughter clinging shyly to her leg for the first time in years. I wore the red coat, of course. How could I not? It had become more than fabric, it was armor, declaration, rebellion. Beneath it, I'd layered myself in pieces that felt like home: a floral scarf from the thrift store, earrings shaped like pens, a gift from Lou, and boots scuffed from all the walking I'd done since leaving Susan's house. Every step I took through that crowded room felt lighter than the last. When they called me to the front to speak, I hesitated. Public speaking still made my palms sweat, but this time, I didn't grip the podium like a lifeline. I looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, some new, and smiled. Not the polite, practiced smile of someone trying to please. A real one. The kind that starts in your chest and spreads outward until it reaches your eyes. I never thought I'd be here, I began, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. Not because I didn't dream of it, but because I stopped believing dreams mattered after a certain age. Behind me, someone sniffled. Probably Dolores. She cried at everything. I paused, letting the moment settle, then added, "But here's the thing about dreams. They don't care how old you are. They just wait. Patiently. Stubbornly. Until you're ready to pick them up again." Applause erupted before I even finished, warm and unrelenting. For once, I didn't shrink away from it. I stood taller, soaking it in like sunlight. The cake was ridiculous. 3 tiers of vanilla sponge frosted in buttercream so smooth it looked like silk. On top, written in bold red letters, were the words, "To beginnings at any age." Myra nudged me when I stared at it, tears threatening to spill over. "You earned this," she said simply, handing me a fork. "Now eat it." We sang "Happy Birthday" to me, not because it was my birthday, but because someone decided every milestone deserved celebration. As I blew out the candles, 21, because why not, I closed my eyes and whispered a silent thank you. To Frank, for giving me notebooks instead of silence. To the girl in the box, for refusing to disappear completely. To myself, for surviving long enough to find her again. Later, as slices of cake were passed around, I noticed something tucked under my plate. A folded note, written in shaky handwriting I recognized instantly. Proud of you, Mom. Love, Susan. I held it tightly, tracing the edges with my thumb. No explanation, no apology. Just those 6 words. And somehow, that was enough. Susan calls more often these days. Sometimes, we talk about nothing, weather, recipes, books she's reading. Other times, there's an awkwardness between us, like 2 strangers learning each other's language. She asks questions now, real ones. About my writing, about the shelter, about how I'm doing. Once, she even admitted, I don't know how to fix what happened. You can't, I told her gently. But you can keep trying. Tommy sends texts with photos of his dog and updates about school. He hasn't apologized, but he doesn't have to. His effort is apology enough. Claire writes letters filled with sketches and stories, signing them with little hearts. They're trying. Slowly, imperfectly, they're trying. And me? I'm not waiting anymore. Not for their approval, their forgiveness, their understanding. If they want to be part of my life, they'll have to meet me where I am now, not where they left me. Not where they expect me to stay. One crisp autumn afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the house I used to call home. The porch light was on, glowing softly against the fading daylight. I hadn't planned to come here, it just happened. Like my feet remembered the way before my mind did. For a moment, I expected the weight of sorrow to crash over me. But it didn't. Instead, I felt peace. The kind that comes from knowing you've survived something unimaginable and emerged stronger for it. I walked up the driveway, past the rose bushes I'd planted decades ago. They were still thriving, their petals bright against the gray sky. Through the window, I saw Susan moving around the kitchen, stirring something on the stove. Tommy sat at the table, scrolling through his phone. Claire perched on the counter, laughing at something he said. They looked happy. Whole. And while a small part of me wished I could step inside and reclaim my place among them, the rest of me knew better. That chapter was closed. This wasn't my story anymore. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of the mailbox. My name was scratched off, just as I'd imagined. But instead of pain, I felt relief. Letting go isn't always about forgetting, it's about choosing what stays with you. And I chose myself. If you had told me 5 years ago that I'd find myself after 60, I would have laughed. Not a joyful laugh, but a bitter one. The kind that says, too late. Because that's what I believed back then, that self-discovery was for the young, the brave, the unbroken. Not for women like me. But here I am. Standing tall in a red coat, surrounded by people who see me, holding a book with my name on the cover. Writing stories about women who refuse to disappear. Loving fiercely, living fully, without waiting for permission. It's strange, isn't it? How life has a way of circling back to moments we thought were lost forever. How pain can carve paths we never knew existed. How endings can become beginnings if you let them. So here's what I know now. You don't stop being worthy when you stop being useful. Your worth doesn't depend on who remembers you or how loudly they cheer. It lives in the quiet spaces, the mornings spent sipping coffee, the pages filled with words only you understand, the courage it takes to say, I matter. And maybe that's the greatest lesson of all, you don't have to wait for anyone else to see you. Not your children, not your spouse, not the world. All you need is yourself. And trust me, you're worth finding.